On November 1st, 1955, the Vietnam War started, and it went on, and it met very stiff opposition, and there were also people who supported it. As the war went on, some people started to feel that they were betrayed by their government because the government was not telling them the whole truth about what was going on. In 1968, when the U.S. was desperate for troops, the government started using the draft to select people to join in the U.S. Army.
September 14th.
Groups like the Yippies or Youth International Party, the DNS or Students for a Democratic Society participated in other riots going around the country, and we would be the ones to come together to lead this rally. In 1967, it was decided that the Democratic National Convention would be held in Chicago. Mayor Daley was arguing for this, and others agreed because Chicago had a pretty good record regarding riots where other states had not. In July of 1968, Yippie leaders tried to get permits for Lincoln Park to hold the rally, though later those permits were denied. But they were still planning on holding the rallies no matter what. During the riots at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, the miscommunication between the protesters and the police brought new light to the way the government handled protests and how it affected what side people were on when it came to the war.
Democrats convene in Chicago.
The convention had started. Chicago made it the perfect place for these rallies to start because there were going to be a lot of politicians there, and one of their goals was to put pressure on the politicians. There would also be a lot of press there to cover the DNC, therefore they would be on high alert because law enforcement needed to protect the politicians. It was because there were these tensions that the police had to be extremely careful not to let anything happen that seemed too violent. It led to the miscommunication of protesters and police because there was this increased tension. They had extra tension, and had it not been there, this would not be the same. On the first day of the convention, there was a huge turnout of people at the rally. Almost 10,000 people showed up, and they were there for different reasons. Some were rallying against the Vietnam War, and others because of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. That happened a couple weeks before. Though these reasons that people came out to the rally were to protest the government in general. For example, groups running the protest asked for permits not to be able to sleep in the park, but they were not given. They took this to mean that the government's way of supporting the war because having the anti-war protest would go against that premise. Therefore, it drove the protests to fight even harder. The government would have been able to carry the things that they were doing on, and the demonstrators protesting the government understood that people would recognize what was going on. This also exposed the problems that were going on, and therefore more people understood what had happened. The protesters found ways that they were at a disadvantage because of the government, like the fact they did not have a permit, and therefore they used this reason and thought that their freedom of speech was being taken away. Therefore, they exposed what the government's true goals and values were regarding these protests, but then also using them in general.
Extraordinary. It began for us when one of our brothers quite rightly lowered an American flag to half-mast. No one since then has mentioned the rightness of his act. It followed with an unprovoked charge of the pigs into our space.
They're not going to let us out of this park in any organized way. So for the purposes of survival, you should move out, you should float out in small groups and do whatever you're going to do outside of the park around the city. Don't get trapped in some kind of large organized march which can be surrounded. I'll see you in the street.
How long will it mean?
The protests were very violent. This sent a message about the way that people looked at the war, but also how governmental systems were run. As quotes from people who were at the riots, protests scattered every which way and rushed out of the park, blindly falling over each other as tear gas assaulted their eyes. Their protests grew violent when the police attacked with clubs and didn't stop when someone was subbed to the ground. Because these protests were violent, it sent a message about how people viewed the war and how it showed the government's true systems were run. People did not understand the truth of the systems in place in society. This was because during the protesters were exercising their right to peaceful protest. The police came and tried to get them to stop protesting. This is when the violence started. They had the right to peaceful protest taken away from them. Once police started hitting, they also had the right to self-defense. This was revealed in showing that the government did not have their best interests at heart, and they did not follow what the Constitution said.
Jerry Rubin.
Police are brutal. Police protect the status quo, and police consider enemies of the state anybody who stands up and challenges what the
The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve
Our
disorder.
provocation was with a purpose. We thought that we were being provocative in order to expose the true nature of the convention and of the police and of the army.
It wasn't until after the protests that happened that the true message and understanding came out. For example, the protests created a clear divide for who was for and against the war. You can see in pictures there is a clear divide between the policemen and the demonstrators. This was the divide that people were talking about. Because the protest provided a clear example of the divide between who was for and against the war, which may have not happened had the protests not gone on. It was known that there were people on different sides regarding the Vietnam War, as what would happen with any controversial topic. These protests gave a clear visual and divide. It was also these protests that people got the ideas for which side they were on. Some saw that the police were being overly violent and that the protesters were standing up for their human rights. Others would say the police just doing their jobs, realizing those members of the police were sided with the government, which ultimately led them to being for the war. At the time, there were public officials that were trying to spin what was going on at the riots, but it was later, many years later, that it had come out what had really happened. The news reporters held a big role in shaping the story of the protesters and the way each side was perceived. Because the news reporters held a big role in shaping each side of the story, news reporters portrayed a lot of the communication between the demonstrators and the public officials. They were the ones that were capturing the tension between the police and the demonstrators. This showed the great amount of tension that led to the miscommunication, which led to the violence and the riots. This changed the way that the protesters were viewed because the politicians could say one thing, but really on film or on camera, it was something different. This shared and shaped the way that people thought about the events based on those images. The convention ended and the riots lasted for a bit longer, and as earlier said, it would not be until years later that people would understand the true miscommunication because of the great amounts of tension that went on during the riots of the 1968 Democratic National Convention.